Hello again, first and sixth period classical humanities. Today I'm recording our second recorded lecture for classical humanities during this coronavirus remote teaching period. Let me say before I start a couple of things. A lot of students did very well responding to the Google Classroom questions earlier in the week, which is encouraging. I did note, however, that a lot of students have not yet watched the first lecture. I can see the views on YouTube, and that's something you need to do. I know that many of you might think it easier and quicker to go through the actual slideshow. Of course it is, but the point being that in these lectures that I expand on certain points and touch upon things, and I'm going to see if you can understand these points. Some of these points will come up in an exam. Um, Hopefully we'll get back to school and be able to do that. So you should try and keep up with this. I know it's hard to have that discipline to actually, not procrastinate and tackle the work at home. But we all have to try and keep up with things. So thank you to those people who have been actively engaging. I would ask those of you who have not yet partaken in the classroom questions to do so. Also to engage with the lecture material, and of course to complete the assignments. For sixth period, those assignments are coming from me, from first period from Miss Stearns, and you will need to keep up with those. Right. Okay, so let's get on with it then. The last day we discussed the Roman military. Today we're going to explore how the Roman Empire expanded, and later we'll also talk about some pastimes, touch up on some of the material that's coming up in the Google quiz as well. Okay, let's bring it up to there. Right, so here we go. Roman expansion in Italy. So what do we have going on here? Roman expansion in Italy. So it took 200 years for the Romans to conquer all of Italy. This was not a straightforward process. These neighboring tribes and other civilizations did not want to just succumb to the Romans, did not see this as destined. And I suppose their greatest opponents on the Italian peninsula were the Etruscans. And once the Etruscans were overcome, the rest of the Italian tribes did fall one after the other. Now, one feature of the Roman Empire, and bear in mind that the Roman Empire exists within the Republic initially. That is, an empire defined as a nation conquering foreign peoples that exists in the time of the Roman Republic. Remember, the Roman Republic lasts roughly from 500 BCE to around the birth of Jesus, and then the empire is for the period for the 500 years thereafter. So we can pretty neatly divide it. Now, one of the reasons that helped the Romans was that they generously granted conquered Italian tribes citizenship. Now, the word generous might be not quite exact here. It took them time. They didn't do it overnight. But what happened in many of the areas that Romans conquered was this. They would go in, there's a battle. The Romans could be quite brutal. They would punish the defeated tribes, defeated civilizations by taking many of their soldiers and women too into slavery, bringing them back to Rome and other Roman towns in the expanding Roman civilization and having them work and so forth. We'll talk about slavery later. But after a period of time, they did extend the benefits of Roman civilization to those areas. We'll talk more about what those were. And then at a certain point, they would also extend citizenship. That is, that these peoples, the Italian peoples and later the Greeks and the Spanish and different peoples would have partake in local democracy and get to have a say and also get citizenship eventually. Now, this enabled them identify more with Rome, um, and to be more accepting of this. So it's not entirely generous in the Romans' behalf. It is a way to absorb foreign peoples and to prevent against attacks and insurrections and rebellions and so forth. But we shouldn't, again, we shouldn't look at Romans as being too generous. Maybe I should change that word generous because it is strategic. Um, One of the things they did when they absorbed far-flung colonies and pacified them is that they were used for trade, and this helped to make Rome very, very rich indeed. There was trade between Rome and the provinces, but we shouldn't think this is an open and fair trade. This is a trading system that is designed to enrich the Romans, and especially Roman patricians and the noble families. Many of the generals and officers who went, well, they were always patricians, or certainly from um, families that had worked themselves up from the plebeian class. And these people, the reason they took on these positions were because they then began to actually get the rights to extract materials from those provinces and therefore enriching themselves. So, for example, there was a famous Roman general called Marius, and when he went with the Roman legions to Spain to defeat the Spanish tribes, afterwards he was able to exploit the mines in Spain and sell these materials and enriching himself, and thus launching a political career back in Rome. Also, as we mentioned in the military section, they were able to absorb the best of the um, fighting forces from these provinces. So, for example, the Cretians were known for their archers, so archers from Crete, cavalry from Spain, slingers from Syria, and so forth. Right. Now, how about expansion outside of Italy? Well, as Rome became a regional power, they became rivals with the North African city state of uh, Carthage. Carthage, think around modern day Libya. Um, so there was a series of wars with Carthage, known as the Punic Wars. Now, these were difficult, um, and they took a long time to play out. And in the early years, the Carthaginians actually had much success. They had a very famous leader called Hannibal, and he is depicted here on the right in a famous event. He with an invading army invades through Spain, over the Pyrenees, and then down through the Alps. And here we have the picture of him, depiction of famous Hannibal with his army, and including elephants, marching down into Italy, attacking and sacking Rome itself. And so this is showing that the Romans didn't always have it their own way. But eventually, Roman organization, Roman population, demographics, resources, brilliance, ingenuity overcomes and they defeat Carthage and they triumph. Um, and Carthage indeed is destroyed forever. This is not something the Romans always did, but in the case of Carthage, they had caused the Romans so many problems that they decided to ensure that Carthage would never rise again. They completely destroyed uh, the city of Carthage, and according to legend, sowed the fields with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Now, it is fair to say that the Romans blended cruelty and exploitation with toleration of foreign cultures. So we touched upon this exploitation with the riches of the mines and trading and slavery and, their brutality and exactitude in battle. But also we have toleration. We have toleration. Now, what do we mean by this? Toleration is not the modern day standard of, let's say, appreciating and being welcoming of foreign religions. What it is, it's a lower bar, but nonetheless, something that was not common in the ancient world. It was the idea that one would actually put up with and allow other cultures and cultural practices and religions to be carried out and exercised and practiced. So, in religion especially, the Romans were quite happy to allow the various conquered peoples to continue honoring their own gods. Now, it was often the case that they were encouraged to and would add the Roman gods to their pantheon of gods. But the Romans did not insist on them ceasing worship of their traditional gods. Um, and of course, again, this meant that uh, these peoples were more likely to accept Roman rule because they allowed them to carry on with many of the elements of their daily lives. So again, we can see this as strategic on the Roman behalf. Now, famously, and most of us derive from some sort of Christian culture. Certainly, the United States has a Christian tradition, as does Europe. And so it is well known that the Romans, before they embraced Christianity, actually persecuted the Christians. So this idea of the Romans as intolerant has spread, but it is not a representative image. Uh, so why then did the Romans persecute the Christians? We will cover the Christians more and Christianity more towards the end of this unit, because that is an important part of the Roman legacy. But why did they? Why did they persecute the Christians? And the answer is, of course, because the Christians, Christian faith said that there is only one God, and thou shalt not honor and worship other gods. So the Christians refused to worship the Roman gods, and worse still, of course, in the time of the empire, from the point of view of the Roman elite, is that they refused to honor the Roman emperors, who in this age of the empire had come to be regarded as living gods. And this is why they were persecuted. But we will deal more with the Christian story again. Right. So, Roman expansion outside of Italy. We don't need to go into too much detail here, but you can see from the map how they spread out. They spread to the west, they spread to the south, they spread to the east, and as they did so, they absorbed cultures. Now, above all, the Romans absorbed the Greek culture, and the Greek deities are parallel to the Romans. So, as we said before, when we were covering things like the Iliad, we actually read the Roman version. So we had the Roman names for the Greek gods. So all of the same gods were absorbed into the Roman tradition and actually displaced the more older Roman gods. And this is a remarkable thing. And again, it goes back to this idea that the Greek legacy the, is actually a Greco Roman legacy. Because, of course, the Romans had a great respect for Greek culture and worshipped the gods. So all of the gods continue to exist within the Roman tradition, which is quite extraordinary. Now, as they went through these areas, the Romans built superior forts and roads. And these were done in a way that ensured that the Roman armies could move between their regions and move troops from place to place in order to control and quell any possible rebellions. We will touch upon engineering again. What is fascinating here is that the Romans standardized how they built their roads, how they built their forts, and like any great domineering force, they had a very particular way of doing things. Almost reminds me of McDonald's, with their specifications as to how each restaurant should be run and how much size, what size each hamburger patty has to be. Well, the Romans had very strict instructions as to how forts and roads could be built, and therefore they were replicated throughout the empire. Now, leaving the empire behind us for a moment and talking about arts and leisure pursuits, what is the connection here? Why have I put this at this point in time? Well, it's because power meant that art could flourish. When you have security in your food supplies, you have grain coming in from different regions so that the poor remain fed. Um, when the nobles are wealthy and have money to spend, then art and luxury can flourish. And so there's a video here that I want you guys to watch, embedded in the slideshow. It is on art and sculpture, particularly within the Roman Empire. I'm trying to connect this to the idea of power so you guys can see how it is connected. So please click on the link here You can see it. Roman sculpture link. Please watch that video. Now, we're going to skip this activity here at the bottom. It's something I would have done in class, but it doesn't quite work out as well for remote teaching, so I'm skipping that. So hopefully you guys will watch. Well, I want you. It's really compulsory that you would complete the Google quiz on the leisure activity on Roman dress, clothing, fashions, the bathhouses, and leisure in general. And so just to say a few words about this here, and this part of the slideshow will help you to answer the Google quiz questions. We have here in the picture on the right, the beautiful bath of Caracalla. Really splendid, wonderful. The architecture here, the art, everything about it is very impressive. They would go to the bathhouses. Now, don't think of them necessarily as like swimming pools. There is some of that going on, some lounging about in the water, some light swimming, but it's much more than that. They are places to meet, to have business meetings, to relax, to meet with one's colleagues, with one's friends, to hang out. And they also operated as leisure centers. Leisure centers. There was wrestling rooms. And of course, when you go to these places, the slaves were there, slaves working there to clean you. A particularly disgusting job for one slave was to use a strigil to scrape off the dirt by bathing people in olive oil, and then the lucky slave would have to clean you off and scrape off your dirt before you got to go into the pools. And of course, 3 different types of pools, including the caldarium, which is particularly impressive because we see here central heating, the hypocaust system. The Romans having hot running water and having hot thermal spas for their customers. And these were for all Romans, not just the patricians, but for the ordinary people of Rome, the plebeians. And these baths then are copied outside of Rome, in Roman settlements and towns throughout the empire, and even as far-flung as places in England, which is why you get the town of Bath in England. Right. Very good. Now, at the bottom of this slideshow, you will also see here a link to the movie Gladiator, to look at the gladiators. Of course, very famous. Check out these scenes. They are a little bit violent, but, you know, this is a high school class, so I'm not worried about that. Check it out. Think about how that's being depicted and all that entails. And I do have some questions on that too. And here on this slide, we have a mock-up, an artistic impression of what the Circus Maximus would have looked like in Roman times. An absolutely huge stadium in Rome. It could hold up to 250,000 people. Think about that. 250,000 people in the ancient world. That's when the world's population was far, far, far smaller than it is today. But here in Rome, the world's first mega city, the first city to hold over 1 million people, 250,000 people could gather in this stadium to watch chariot racing. So chariot racing, how was that similar to modern day horse racing? What was different about it? Well, if you look in the Google form reading quiz, if you think about that, do your research, do some follow-on reading, you would find that there were similarities, but it is far more violent. So again, we see the Romans, as with the gladiatorial contests, the sports that they like to watch violence as well. So there is that cruder side to the Romans, as well as the sophisticated theater-going Romans, the bathhouse-going Romans. We have this violence. But of course, it's not the Romans themselves who are having to partake in the dangerous chariot racing, or of course, even worse, gladiatorial contests. It is the slaves. We will discuss the idea of the slaves in our next lecture. So please make sure that you do the reading and complete the Google form quiz, and I will send you guys another lecture on Monday. Thank you, and I hope you guys all have a good weekend.